Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this week. My name is Tanya, and I'm the Marketing Manager over here at Struxoft Solutions. So just for those of you who are new with us today, our STAR solution MWF, or Metal Wood Framer, is our Revit-based BIM framing solution that allows users to automate Revit walls, floors, ceilings, and trusses in light gauge steel and also in wood. So today, however, our technician Christina will be walking you through bracing options available within MWF. She'll be covering flat strap bracing with plates, K-bracing, MMV bracing, and more. So just before we get going, I'd like to remind everyone that at the end of the webinar, we'll be taking a few live questions. In order to be selected, please press the raise hand button on the dashboard. Just please also make sure that your mic is working correctly. If you'd prefer, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. For those questions, we'll make sure to get back to you by email within 24 hours. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to hand off to Christina now.
All right, thanks a lot, Tanya. Hey, everyone, and good morning. So for today's webinar, we're going to cover basically the bracing options that are in the miscellaneous option in the panel's properties. So I'm sure a handful of you guys have probably used some of these commands already before, but I thought I would go over them again a little bit more in depth and show you just a few tricks that I like to show on trainings now and again to put in either your basic X bracing, your K bracing, and then also the MMV could be useful as well, just to get the diagonals in there. So let's start off with just the basic bracing command. So I'll just go to my section view for this. And the first one that we're just going to look at once this properties loads in is just that plain basic bracing command right after the horizontals. So once you're in the miscellaneous, the first kind of bracing option that we have here, if I go ahead and just edit that, this is probably one of the easiest ways we have just to add in, if ever you wanted to add in the X bracing. Can also even be used for backing, technically, if you did want to use it for that as well. But in a nutshell, this is what I usually refer to as the go-to way to create X bracing. Now, there is this separate X bracing tab, which you can use. It's a little specific. It was kind of, again, customized to include a type of void that would have been placed on the bottom track. So it's, again, kind of a custom feature that we did a couple of years ago that was built into the software. So you can explore this if you'd like, but if you want to use this regular bracing option, A, I just find it's a bit easier, and B, it also gives you the option to add in plates, whereas the other one is just going to be your flat strap bracing, and that's all it was really created for. So we're mainly going to focus on this guy just to start off. And if you're used to the horizontals or pretty much any of our commands in MWF, it follows the same kind of workflow. You're just picking which side of the wall you want to place it on. So you can obviously pick the exterior, interior side of the wall. It's just going to go straight on the exterior or interior most side. Or you can place it on both sides as well. After that, we're just going to go ahead and pick the family we want to use. I'm going to try and reproduce some X bracing here, so I'll go ahead and just pick a flat strap. And then from this point going forward, you're just picking the member-to-member reference that you want to run this bracing. So like our horizontals option and a lot of our other options, we can use actual studs and actual members built into the panel as your reference point. So you can just run it, if you just want it for a singular panel, you can just run it from something like E1 to E2. It's automatically going to fill in the elevation, so just the length of your actual stud, and that's where it's going to run the bracing. So if we're looking at this from the interior side of the wall, We're going to run it from E1 down here all the way to E2 up here, and it's going to hit the highest point of the stud. So that's where our bracing is going to stop. So you can definitely use the members as a reference, and you could always adjust this elevation as well. It doesn't have to be exactly what the member height is. You can put in your own custom elevation if you just want the actual bracing piece to stop a little lower along that member. So you could always adjust the elevation. But for this particular example, I've got 3 panels, and this is just one continuous Revit wall. So I'm just going to bounce around back to the floor plan. So this is, like I mentioned, one continuous Revit wall. I've just thrown in the basic split markers. And that's all I'm using to break up these panels. So only reason I bring that up is because when you're in the bracing, if you do have multiple panels in one particular wall and you want to span that X bracing all the way across the wall, you can still do that within this bracing command, but we can pick the start and end references instead. So these references use the actual Revit wall as a reference instead of just your individual panel members. So basically what that means is even though I'm in panel 113 and I'm in those specific panels properties, I can still run X bracing from one particular corner all the way to the other end on my wall, and it'll run that full length of the wall since we're using the start and end reference points instead. So I got this question actually in a training last week, and I thought it was a pretty handy little option just to highlight that you could always run it across multiple panels within the same wall as long as you use the start and end reference instead of the individual members. So a nice little hack, if you will. So when you're doing start and end references, you do have to kind of auto fill in the elevation, of course. So we're going to start from the bottom left corner of 113, and we're going to go to the top right corner of 115. So technically, I'm going to modify the end elevation. And I'll put this elevation at 9'6". I'm not going to go the full height of my stud since my bracing, you'll see in a minute once it's actually modeled, it'll be easier to look at. But it overlaps with the center. So that's why I'm going to drop it just about 6 inches. So it's not, the corners of my flat strap aren't sticking out of my wall. It'll make sense in a minute, I promise. So I've got that start and end reference. You do have start and end offsets as well that you could always use to either bring in the members, but I'm going to leave those to 0 for now, and we'll adjust them in a bit. But for the actual flat strap itself, if you are using something other than a flat strap, if you want to use this again for backing, you can really use this for any particular type of framing member. And this is just to modify the actual family. So if I wanted to take that piece of flat strap and rotate it, there's the rotation option. There's also an interior-exterior justification. This is just to move the actual member laterally within the wall. So you can put positive or negative values, and it's just going to move that piece of flat strap, in this case, either within the structural layer, or I can move it a little bit further away from the wall as well. We're just moving that laterally. The other thing as well is that you can also add in extensions. And again, this is just for the piece of bracing. So I'm just going to add this so we can see what that looks like, and then we'll come back in and do the plates. So it runs the full length of the wall. It still is a part of panel 113, so just keep that in mind. Even though it spans across multiple panels, if I run shop drawings and include this, you will have a piece of bracing that looks like it's floating in space when you actually go ahead and create shop drawings. But typically, you'll probably want to use this just for the modeling. So again, it's using the actual wall references, so it can span across multiple panels that you have in that one wall. So just to give a little idea in terms of placement as well. So this guy I put at 9.6, and basically what that means is it takes the center point of my flat strap and it aligns that with the center of my end stud. So if I go all the way down here to where it's set to 0, that's why I've got this piece of strap sticking out a little bit, might go a little bit too far than what we want. But it's just because it's hitting the 0 mark on my end stud and it's using the center line of that member, not the corners necessarily, which is why we are getting that to stick out a little bit. But we're going to go ahead and adjust that. So back into the bracing. So one of the ways that we can kind of adjust that is with this start and end offsets. So this also works with the plates as well, really well. So I'll go ahead and add a plate first so we can see what that looks like with the default settings. But then we're going to go back and again adjust these offsets and get them to where we want it to be. So all of these options down here are just the plate settings. So you can turn on the plate just to enable it if you want it on the inside of the wall. And then your start and end plates, they're generic plate families that we load in. So they could always be customized in here as well as the thickness. So the actual plate size itself can be modeled in here. And then you do have plate position options, which if you think of these little radio buttons as the outermost sides or outermost corners of the plates, that's how we're positioning the plates. So right now I just have the center of my plate that's going to hit the center of my flat strap at the very end. So I'm going to go ahead and update that just with the basic plate positions. I'll say OK. And this is kind of the standard to how we place the plates if you're just turning it on out of the box without any kind of offsets. So it's just, again, if you think of that radio button, center of the plate to the center of my bracing, and this is at the 0 point in elevation. So we haven't moved it at all in elevation. So realistically, this is probably sticking out a little bit, and we're going to want to align kind of this bottom left corner over here. And probably the same thing with this guy. We're going to want to align the top corner with the inner or outer edge, I should say, of our panel. So easiest way that I find to do that, again, I'm going to pop back in here, go to the bracing. So to make a long story short, you can always adjust these radio buttons if you'd like, but typically you're probably going to want the bracing to hit the center of the plate anyway, so you won't really have to adjust these at all. Where I like to adjust is that start and end offset and play around with these options. So because my plate is 1 foot, I basically want to move this piece 6 inches, so half of course, the height and width of my plate. So I'm going to put a start and end elevation, or start and end offset, excuse me, of 6 inches. And I also could move this up a little bit. So I'm also going to pop in the elevation here of 6 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and update that. And then that should really be kind of the last change that we have to do for this bracing. So my plate is nice and aligned with my corner. My flat strap is sitting pretty much on the center of that plate. And I've also got the same thing on the other side. You can always play around with the radio buttons for that plate. You definitely can. Just keep in mind that the bracing isn't going to be adjusted. So it might happen where you have your flat strap sticking out of your plate a little bit. It takes a little bit of adjusting just to figure out the bracing to get exactly what you want. But this is kind of my preferred way of adjusting the plates, of adjusting the bracing. So the bracing is still hitting the center of my plate, and then with that start and end offset, I'm just adjusting it to hit the corners. So all in all, if you're using the standard 1-foot plates, you're just kind of adjusting the offsets to meet half the width and half the height of that plate. And then the elevation you could adjust freely depending on what you need, but I've got 10-foot high walls, so I'm also just keeping that in mind and adjusting that with half the height of the plate. So that's a general rule, I'll just say, is to use whatever half the width and half the height is and use that as your offset. And then again, you'll probably, even if you're using this on singular panels, want to use the start and end reference, because it does let you move the member more freely within the panel itself. These guys, you're kind of forcing them to lap on a stud, which is fine. But in this particular case, it's not really lapping on anything because we're having those plates there. So that's, again, just another example of where you'll want to use the start and end offset instead. But that's all I pretty much wanted to show for this option for the bracing. If you did want to use this for X bracing, you can still pretty much use the exact same settings. You'll just have to swap out the elevations so that on the starting side now, it's going to start at 9'6". And then you can add that as a second line. And that's going to be pretty much it for this tool. But that's it. My kind of preferred method to add in the X bracing. You get the plates. If you wanted to modify a generic plate as well, you could always rename it. You can modify the family. Do whatever you'd like to it. But it's an easy way just to get the bracing and the plates. And you could also span it across multiple panels if you wanted to do that. Okay, so that's enough rambling on that bracing option. The next one I just want to highlight is the K bracing. So the one that falls right after the bracing, of course. So we'll pop in here. So K braces, for anyone who's not familiar, it's just going to be a actual diagonal that will lip and dimple if you're rolling into your studs. So it's going to be directly in the structural layer. It's not going to be on any exterior or interior face. And with this guy, I mean, the pictures will help a lot, at least with this one. If you increase the number of sections, it becomes a little bit more self-explanatory than maybe the first method of bracing that we saw. But there are still a couple of little kind of hacks that you can use for this. But basically how the K-bracing works is it starts with your leftmost member and it places in every bay. So if my leftmost member is E1, excuse me, then this kind of intermediate member here is going to be S1. So you can span it between different bays, and you could always add in, like the other bracing, as many different variations as you need to. But I'll maybe put this bracing in my first bay, and I'll also invert it and put it in my last bay. And maybe I also want a continuous horizontal just running through the panel to meet both ends of the panel. So to achieve something like that, we're going to start off with obviously 2 sections. My leftmost member is E1. You can control where this breaks. So you can adjust the offsets if ever you want it to break at a different point. But by default, it just breaks it up evenly. So if you're adding 3 or 4 sections, it breaks it up, of course, evenly depending on the height of your wall. So this is where you could also repeat the same bracing. So if I wanted this same bracing for maybe 3, 4 more bays, I can just go ahead and repeat this pattern, let's say 2, 3, 4 more times, or I could also just tell it to repeat until it hits the end of my wall. So that's if you want to take this and have it again repeat in every bay, but we're not going to do that. We just want the first bay, and then we'll add one again in the last bay. So I'm only going to repeat it once. And then if you did want to add in multiple braces and have this be kind of a singular pattern, that's also, again, something you can do too. This can be considered one pattern, excuse me, that spans across 3 bays. And I can have this entire thing repeat 2, 3, or 4 more times. But we're going to have, again, singular brace. I just wanted to repeat once. I want typically these diagonals on my structural center line. And then just the actual family that you want for your diagonal. Besides that though, we do place a horizontal blocking piece automatically. So you just have to pop in that family. And then you do have a few options to control that. If you wanted to double it up, if you wanted to break the horizontals as well, or you can only have it break once it hits a double stud. So again, this guy is more useful for, say, something like this, where if you want that horizontal piece to be continuous, then you can go ahead and just not leave this checked off. But if you do break it, it will break on your intermediate stud. So this is everything for the horizontals. And then looking down here to some of these cutback options, I know it can be a little tricky, but it's really just depending on your brace attachment options. So I'm going to go ahead and just add this pattern first. We'll add that to the list. And once you've got kind of a pattern added in and that's selected, you can then go ahead and choose your attachments. So the clearances are going to depend just on where you're actually lapping. So as a default, we're always going to place the actual bracing on the vertical pieces. So it'll look like the picture. It's going to lip into your studs. So that's where you'll see it with the verticals. You can always lap it into, let's say, your tracks or your horizontals by selecting all of these options if you wanted to lap on those pieces instead. Or you can pick the center, but this one isn't really commonly used. Since you're getting a 3-member point connection, it's not something that we see very often. So it's typically just the horizontal or the vertical. So I'll leave everything to vertical for now. And then we'll take a look at some of these clearance options, but you're only going to need a handful of these depending on what you're using. So if you're lapping everything on a vertical, you're only going to need clearance from the horizontal members, and then you can kind of ignore the stud options. But we'll take a look at that in a bit. So before I get kind of into these other options, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. I'm going to say OK, and we'll get our actual bracing in there. So nothing too complex, really. Again, it's just actually in your structural layer, so it would lap onto your studs. And we do add the horizontal by default. So where you can start getting into some of the clearances is, this might be a little too close to your horizontal member. This guy as well. So I can maybe just add 2 inches of clearance, let's say from my horizontal blocker, and maybe also from my tracks. I want to raise this a little bit so I can add that bit of clearance. So that's where you can start messing around with these. So if I wanted, let's say, 2 inches of clearance from my track, this applies to both your top and bottom track. And I could also get a little bit of clearance from my horizontal. So let's go ahead and modify that. So you get obviously a bit more space, and it also just brings in the diagonal a bit more since the angle isn't as sharp. So you're also getting just more surface area to place your dimple. So 2 inches might be a little bit much. You could obviously adjust that to whatever you need. But that's just an option to give you clearance and also just adjust the size of your diagonal at the same time, maybe make it less sharp. Can do that just within the cutbacks. So besides these cutback options here, you've also got diagonal extensions. If you do find it is cutting a bit short, you want to extend it as well. You can extend it on the left or right side. Add whatever you need to, and it just modifies the diagonal piece and extends that. And then the last option again, for plates. Again, not something I see used a whole lot, but you can kind of use these radio buttons to adjust your plate. And my picture's a little shrunken in. It's just because of my 4K laptop. But you can adjust the buttons and put plates at these locations. And it's the same type of idea. It's just to insert, you can adjust the width and height of the plate and then pick the side that you want the plate on. But not something, again, I see a whole lot when it comes to the K-bracing. It's mostly just adding in those diagonals. So that's just adding it to the first bay. If we wanted to do the same and add it to the last bay and just invert that diagonal, It's pretty much the same type of idea. I can invert it. I'm just going to create a new pattern for that. And my leftmost member this side is going to be S7, so the one that's highlighted. And then I just create a new pattern for that and I add it to the list here. So you don't have to repeat it X number of times. You can just add it as different types, basically, and choose your bays that you need to add the K-bracing to. Besides that, though, last option that I'll just highlight, if you did want to place a continuous horizontal, it's just a question I had in a training last week that, again, I thought was a good one. There isn't the option directly in the K-bracing. We're just placing horizontals between bays when you're adding it like this. But at the end of the day, you can still go to your horizontals option, add it this exact way, pick your offset. So just span it from, full length of the wall, E1 to E2. I'm not breaking anything. So you can still get your full horizontal piece if you needed that. And then with these kind of individual blockers, they are going to clash, but you can just go ahead and remove those with the edit command, use your delete generated member, and then you're good to go. So this was just an example for a question I had come up last week. So you can still use a combination of the horizontals and the K-bracing if you need that. Just bear in mind, those blockers will just have to be deleted, but it's an easy little workaround to get that full horizontal piece. All right, guys, and last one for today, the MMV. Probably the least commonly used one out of the three. But it's a very similar idea. It just doesn't place any types of horizontal blockers, and it's calculating it by angle instead this time. So it places the same like the K-bracing, and you can still do some clearance options either between the diagonals or from your tracks. But you're basically calculating how many diagonals you're getting just by the minimum and maximum angle that you choose. So again, I'm just going to add a new type, and I can run this again from member to member. So I can add that. You can even span it across multiple bays if you wanted to. It's just going to run from member to member. And the default minimum angle is set to 45 and the maximum is set to 60. And then your start and end studs, if you wanted to double those up by default, you can do that as well. So that's really all there is to the MMV. You can adjust the number of diagonals based on the angle. But the one thing I'll just point out, the minimum angle that we absolutely must have is set to 20. So if I put that to 0, it auto fills into 20. But if you did only want something like the previous example where I've got 2 bracing pieces, usually the minimum to 20 and the maximum to 25. Again, it's all kind of dependent on your wall heights, but for a 10-foot high wall, this seemed to do the trick and only give me 2 diagonals. So you can always run it this way and then you can get that horizontal on its own, but you don't have the options to invert in here. It's a little bit more specific. But you're just calculating it by angle. The one perk I can see with this is that it can always span across multiple bays if ever you did just need a continuous diagonal piece. It's an easy way to do that. All right, guys, that's going to be it for me today. I hope some of you found it helpful. So like Tanya mentioned at the beginning, if there's any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them now.
Thank you, Christina. So as she just mentioned, we'd like to open the floor to all of you. I'd just like to remind everyone that if you'd like to pose a question live, please raise your hand now by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel. Just please also make sure that your audio is working correctly. And just while we wait for any potential questions to come through, just like to let everyone know that the recording of the presentation will be sent through tomorrow. As always, please feel free to share the recording with any colleagues. And if you're looking for the recording a little earlier, it's usually available just a little later today on our social media channels. Okay. It looks like we have a question from Alexander. Alexander, I'm just going to unmute you. All right, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, hi. Thank you for your wonderful lecture. It's useful. It's very useful. My question is with regards to K-bracing.
Mm-hmm.
The problem that I had is when I added a new vertical member to one of the panels that I want to add the K-bracing, and say, if you imagine E1 as the beginning of your panel and you're adding next to it an added structure element, and you want to K-brace to have the K-bracing between E1 and the new element, vertical element,
Okay.
in your panel, it's not doing it. So it appears like the new vertical element inserted to the panel is neglected in terms of K-bracing. This is what I wanted to know, how to solve this problem, or how to get the vertical element to be
Sure.
obvious.
Yeah. It depends how you added in the vertical element. If you just do a straight copy paste, then you just have to obviously add that as part of the panel so that it recognizes it within UID. So the main thing I would say to adjust is, even though I'm adding in a new vertical member here, my K-bracing in the actual properties itself, it should start at the leftmost member, but now it's got S8 in here.
Mm-hmm.
So I would, oh, excuse me. So I would think it should, if I even put S8 as my leftmost member, I'm gonna modify that. I want to see if it recognizes it.
Yeah, this
Oh,
is
is
what
that what you were?
happens. Yeah,
Okay.
so it's deleting the K-bracing in theory.
S8. So if I modify, close. Interesting. Okay, that's actually a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if anything, have you tried adding it in extra ways through maybe something like extra studs might be a little better? I'm not sure how the K-bracing would react to something that's pinned.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I have tried it with adding a structural member.
Let's see, if I
Yeah,
just
and
add
it's
something
pinned.
like this. Oh, Interesting. Okay, now it decided to wake up.
Okay.
But it's a fair point though. I'm gonna run a few more tests on my end. If it doesn't consistently add in with a member that's pinned, but the member itself is still appearing on the section list, I would consider that as a bug. But let me just see if I modify that. It's going to disappear on me again. Okay, now it seems to have stayed put. Interesting. Okay. I would try adding in a member just within extra studs if you can, or as even if you can add it in as a stud pack, basically just something that isn't pinned. Might be an issue with the pinned piece is all I'm thinking. But in theory, whatever member you should add in, as long as it appears on that list, it should consider the bay. So it should behave like this. Not sure what happened the first time
I
around,
see.
but that's exactly how it should behave. So if anything, I'll run a few tests on my end. If I can't get it to consistently appear, I can put it in as a bug for you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's useful.
But let's also try, interesting. So now if I do this, now you've kind of piqued my interest because now if I put this from, let's say, S1, it should go to S9, which let's try it with you. Okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it doesn't ignore the new element that you've added.
Yeah. Okay, that's a fair point. I'm going to put that in as a bug. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. It's a
Thank
very
you.
good point. Yeah. Okay. Is there any other questions, anyone, before we wrap up?
I'll just give it a couple of seconds here to see if there's any last minute ones that come through. All right, well, that looks like it's a wrap for today. So if there are any follow-up questions after I close the session, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact details will be provided along with the recording tomorrow. As well as if you'd like to set up a one-on-one demonstration, we'll be able to do that as well. All right, we'll now be ending the webinar. I just want to say a big thank you to Christina and also thank you to everyone who registered. Have a great day.